White and soft, please.
I'm interested perhaps for you to just maybe share one or two stories to the group about that, and I'm wondering if anybody would be interested to share their, the person's story that they were listening to. And of course, to be ethical, we need to check that that was okay with the person. But I wonder if there's some interesting stories you heard that might be, even one story for the room.
I can share.
Yeah? Do you want to check with your partner?
Already checked. Sorry. It's John told us a story that he's always been concerned about trying to save the world from nuclear disaster through accidental nuclear war, which is a pretty heavy topic to be thinking about. And I commented that I grew up, under that shadow. It's in the background of any second now they could just boom. And I think we all grew up with that. Anyway, so this is almost a life work here. And then sometimes, I guess, he was explaining that you look at the world and you go, is it all worth it? And he had a moment out in nature where he went out with a very good friend into nature and had a moment just looking up and seeing birds pairing in a tree at night and just feeling a connection with that. And from that moment, feeling that we're all, that universal feeling of peace and connectedness, and that's the why. That's why. And even from that 20 years ago or whatever moment, things change, you fluctuate, you go back into old routines of, oh, why am I doing this or whatever. But if you have that moment and you can draw back on that, and you always have that moment that you can pull out of the cupboard.
Yeah.
So I thought that's pretty cool.
Yeah. Beautiful. Thank you.
How great it was to hear it from somebody else.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. And what I'm hearing about that is being in the being under the threat of that nuclear war, and just trying to really do good in the world, and and sometimes that would have maybe being an activist, soldier and soldiering on, and what it's like when you just hit that point where it's overwhelmingly oppressive. The threat of that is overwhelmingly oppressive, and we can go into that sense of being a victim to that oppressor and go AWOL. We can just want to check out, and that what we're hearing in that story is that disconnection. And what's so beautiful to me about the mammalian brain, it's that, and of course we're connected, we're never not connected, but that mammalian brain was the introduction of us feeling connected. We felt connected. And yes.
Is there any way that you can avoid not reaching that tipping point, so you could?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So you don't have to. Yeah.
Evil is said to be the erosion of empathy, the erosion of
On reflection, I think it might be better not to try to avoid reaching the tipping point, but to know what to do when you reach it, and how to use the tipping point creatively and positively, not rather than negatively. Now, if I hadn't reached a tipping point, I wouldn't have had that experience. And that's an experience that is of incredible value, and it had a really a mystical
which
element.
is coming up not only to the higher mind,
So, I think if I had avoided reaching that moment, I might have sold myself short.
And often those, I think you're saying another way of saying those rock bottoms. We rock bottom. I've got to.
There are opportunities as well as as well as
Yeah.
pop-ups.
Yeah, beautifully said. Thank you. Yeah.
You used a line, and I'm not sure how much you reflected on it, or was it one of the lines just going, evil is a lack of empathy,
An erosion of
an
empathy.
erosion. You know, that evil is an erosion of
It's
empathy.
actually a book. That's written.
Right, okay, well, I've not read it obviously. But when you think, say, of the whole refugee issue in this country, there's a lack of empathy, therefore it's a threat. And you think of primates, of course, the outsider is a threat
Yes,
to a
so
primate.
the
They
threat
have roots, yeah.
erodes the empathy, doesn't it?
Yeah,
That
yeah.
constant grinding of a threat erodes the empathy.
But primates, it's their natural thing
If we relax,
to
it's where-
defend against the outside. We are primates,
Yes,
but
that's
we are called to move beyond that to this
Yes.
third stage. But unless we do that,
yes.
we're just a primate and the outsider. And primates can be very vicious. You see those
Well,
nature
they're- you know,
documentaries.
they're- and we are too. So we're
that's happening,
hardwired
yeah.
to detect deception, to fight deception. So we've got that within us to challenge the free riders. And it's who do we think is deceiving us? You know, who do we think is the free rider here? Sometimes,
Gold
you know,
bludgers,
so that
refugees.
can get very mixed up in people's mind around that and lead to very interesting things. So I would like to talk about that level, and I'll leave it there just because we're going to 8, aren't we?
Go as long as you like. Really.
Oh, okay, all right.
Not till midnight.
Midnight.
All right. That wouldn't be ethical, would it? So,
I have a question.
yes.
Well, what about the higher ideals which we don't find in nature?
Well,
I mean,
we're
that's
going
to
to
me.
come here
Yes,
to the
we are.
higher mind.
Ah,
So this
okay.
is the high mind. Yeah.
So-
So it's an evolutionary pathway.
I just got one question. It might be later on, but you mentioned Jung, and did he actually talk about ethical self? Because I know he talked about true self, but did
Yeah.
he also talk about?
I don't know that he did. I don't know that it
Because
was.
I don't think he
No.
used that term.
No, I
That's
don't-
all right.
Yeah.
And Campbell's very critical of this ethics in a lot of ways. You move beyond it.
Well, yes. I mean, there's a lot of criticism of ethics because for some it gets kind of, it's just a rational debate, and it cut off from, like, one of my favourite philosophers, Immanuel Kant, said he was trying to get us out of the fishbowl of the threat that some religions were holding over the people. So he had this idea that man can reason for his own morality. I'll put women in there too. Can reason for his own morality. So in a way it was a movement towards rationalism and cutting off this lower nature and trying to just reason for morality rather than actually utilize the messages from within, to relax and actually have it be part of an empathic, collaborative, bonding, attachment, expression. And that produces, so you've got ethicists who are about the mind and those that are about the heart. And it's, for me, it's about putting them together. The ethical self, is an integral ethical self. Yes, it's all. So I'd like to talk about a client who demonstrates what it's like when the construct of what is creating the threat is actually outside of our conscious mind, and we don't know we're swimming in a fishbowl that's actually holding the threat ever present, and we're walking around, we're doing things, we can't see the threat, but it's always in the undertow, and we're still operating in that fight, flight or freeze. We're still in our winning suit, and we're still checking out in a whole load of ways that you see are very prevalent in our society. You know, the degree of gambling and drinking and drugs and, you know, all sorts of things. So we've got this checking out and this way of trying to force ourselves into this kind of Western model and a Western model of 9 to 5, and and it's ever eroding on the number of hours, our holidays, and we're increasing that sense of how much people have got to put in to work. So what happens when we're actually we're swimming inside that? I've got a client, Mary, and she's 65, and she was made redundant from a corporate job. She had been in the one job for about 20 years. She was a problem solver. She was highly empathic with her team. She was an HR manager. She'd gone to a very senior level. She was incredibly empathic with her team. She was the go-to person. She really supported people. She would stand up. She was very fiery. If somebody in the team, if there was some decision that was coming down from management which was affecting morale, affecting the team, she would go to bat. And what was interesting is she didn't, in her competency, in that corporate elevation, in being good at her job, in being the problem solver, she had no idea she was swimming inside a fishbowl of threat. You couldn't see it. But when she got her redundancy, and she was 65, and she just didn't have the energy, and she couldn't take she couldn't take other things that were offered in that company because it was a threat to her self-esteem. She decided that she wanted a whole new career. And she went off to learn something, which was coaching, which was one of the things I trained. She was frozen in fear. She was blocking herself. She could not learn. She was savage in her criticism. Her sense of her identity was such that she saw herself in a particular way. And to actually be vulnerable as a learner, this ferocity of the critic would just come down and brutalize her vulnerable self, her little chick. So the vulnerable self needs to go up and be looked after by the caring brain. So it was interesting because I was able to say, well, hang on a minute, you've got such a developed ethical part of you that's sitting there looking after everybody else. Who's actually looking after you? And she came up with this. And I said, what is it like when you're looking after the vulnerable people in your team? And what's it like when this part of you is looking after you? And she came up with this analogy that she was a horse-hating trainer who whipped a horse to herself, and she was a horse whisperer to others. And it was absolutely beautiful, the contrast to me in that. And when we sat there and pondered on the cost to her of holding on to that identity, holding on to the threat, holding on to that, it was so threatening that she needed to whip herself with this critic.
What was threatening?
It was threatening taking another job in her organisation because her self-esteem couldn't take it. Her loss of status, her sense of not achieving, and then being so competent and seeing herself every day in her corporate and being so competent. 20 years gives you a sense of, you get to a sort of level. She just couldn't bear to not know how to do something instantly. Her expectations on herself were oppressive, putting her into a threat, and her sense of her worries that if she doesn't get something going, she's going to be, in a financial trauma in the forthcoming years. Regardless of the fact she was actually living in a very established, wealthy suburb in Sydney with, she was very comfortably off, but that threat and her worries were keeping her up at night. So it was fascinating to watch her get this realization that she had within herself this beautiful ethical self, and what it was like for her to now turn that attention and take her vulnerability out of that nightmare and actually bring it into a whole other narrative, a whole other myth of what it's like when you take the stress off someone who's trying to learn, when you actually sit down and you're really caring, you're whispering in their ear to be kind, to be generous, to be encouraging, and that she, instead of it being, she let go of the sense that it was costly to lose her identity. It was costly to be whipping herself. So she was able to make those shift places, and instead of it being pleasurable to be all dressed up in it and have that corporate identity, and instead of getting pleasure from meeting her friends, she had pleasure in kind of bringing through her ethical self. She had relief. She could feel the pathway coming through. I can see that if I change this paradigm, I can actually learn. If I, and so she had that relief, she had that pleasure. So she reversed the pleasures as well, which is part of the motivations and morality of this level. It's a pain, pleasure, morality. It's got associations to pain, which the ethical self can reverse. It's too costly to change. It's too costly not to change. It completely reverses it. I've got my ways of checking out and getting the pleasure and relief from this system. You know what? It's more pleasurable at a higher level of my being to know I'm doing something that's actually ceasing the harm, making my existence better, is fair and respectful and loving and kind for myself. There's a different level of pleasure. It's not dopamine, it's oxytocin. And it comes through reconnecting to the self, reconnecting, rebonding. So it's a different kind of pleasure. So that was Mary's story.
I have a question.
Yes.
Is it too
Please.
early? If you're saying, I'm using different words, but
Yeah.
Innately in all of us we have do good.
Yeah. Hardwired.
We're hardwired that way.
Because
we're hardwired for
great
what?
cohesion to the...
The mammalian. At what point, as humans, did we start to, the societal, whatever, change it? Like, at what point in history have we neglected that side? Where? At what point?
Well, it's a very interesting concept there that we're going into in a different direction, but it's the in-group and the out-group. So, using this aspect of our nature, we're changing the threat of the out-group. So, the in-group is, started off as just Mama and the chicks, and everything else was a threat. Mama, Papa, and the chicks. And then it got to families. So everything outside of the family was a threat. So the in-group's the family, the out-group that's threatening is everything beyond. Or not everything, but the potential. And we're 5 times more, we're going to pick up threat 5 times more than, say, we're on the lookout. We're used to things like dinosaurs being in the environment, and we're kind of looking for threat. We're hypervigilant, 5 times more hypervigilant than to good things. Then that group went to a small group of primates. Then if we go into human society, then it's going to beyond the family to a tribe. So we're feeling unthreatened within because we've got these rules operating that are hardwired. So we're feeling, and we're going to. That group knows our social rules. That group knows that they're going to be ostracized, or the threat of ostracism if they're free riders or cheats, and the group gets onto them. then that group went from being a tribe of 25 to tribes joining together, people settling down, that in-group expanding and getting cohesive rules, and to mini civilizations, 1,000 people. And that's grown to those then becoming nations. So within a nation, everybody outside the nation's the threat. There's they've got police and different things to deal with, the free riders and the cheats and social rules. Well, some of those nation states are becoming continents, and so people from other continents are a threat. And I believe we're moving to a place with this aspect of our mind, we're on the, maybe we'll go to that breaking point, maybe we'll go to the tipping point, maybe it will take us right to the edge. But will that in-group become the planet? Where we actually feel that cohesion, that need to cohere and be connected to and have empathy and cooperate with not just the in-group. It's getting pretty big. You look at the internet as an in-group. These groups are just, the higher mind is just expanding what we think is the in-group. So, now, this brings us to, I guess, my last point. Is,
the in-group doesn't mean it's ethical. It's not always ethical, right?
I hear what you're saying, but this is responding to care for and have attachment to that group. But they can be elitist. So this is the point I'm going to come to now. And I was going to have a bag of chocolates, but I forgot my bag of chocolates. So just to pick up on your point, that's a really important point. We live in a culture that has as its very foundation the fishbowl in which we swim in is premised on threat. And I'm sure you all know this. The Adam Smith, the founder of our modern economics, put together an economic model based on scarcity. Have fewer supplies and greater demand. So supply a little, have the demand for a lot. What happened? Everybody who's not getting what they think they need through media, marketing, keeping up with the Joneses is feeling threatened by that difference between supply and demand. So it's set up in our culture because that economic model, as you're aware of, if there is more demand and less supply, that the competition for the demand would raise the prices, and would have an economy of growth, and that profit would go to the privileged. The privileged few are who are supplying that demand. So we are swimming in that fishbowl that keeps us in that threat consciousness, that has us actually have the in-group get to the place of the 1% of the 1% of the 1%, the world's wealth held by, subgroups of within those major groups, even though there's levels of cohesion in tribes getting together, civilizations together, nation states getting together, continents through the internet getting together, we're still actually in that fishbowl of threat. So I'd like to share you the last story, which is about Rex, who challenged his application of the ethical self to actually come out of his fishbowl of scarcity that we're swimming within. When I first coached Rex 4 years ago, he came as a very bored analyst with a very hostile and unsympathetic boss to his boredom and an angry wife. He was an ardent activist and was drowning in conspiracy theories. So So he was just hot to trot. Now he lived in a recognition of the threat of, the modern economic scarcity myth, and he was, a good soldier and was, fighting the good fight. And it was a hard fight. He was someone who actually had many interests and many passions, and he wasn't living any of them. He did his ethical work the hard way. As many activists do, it's very hard. He took on the Goliaths of the Roads and Traffic Authority and went through the court after court case after court case after court case, fighting the RTA and declaring the fining system and the RTA an illegal institution. He was in huge depression. He was pretty unwell physically. He had ideas to get out of the 9-to-5 rat race and try and get into an internet business, putting e-books together on his interest. He was stalling and procrastinating. He could never find the time. He could never find the energy. He was frustrated and very hard on himself. And he was getting severe backache. He had 2 vintage cars in his backyard rusting. He was a writer that didn't write, a freehand drawer that didn't draw. He loved sci-fi and everything vintage. Sometimes I see the ethical self arising in a client like Ian. Sometimes I can see it happening like in Mary, or see it sitting over there and not being used over here. And with Rex, that was the case. He was hugely ethical. He was hugely ethical in his ideas. He saw the fishbowl, but he was actually stuck in the fishbowl. He was just fighting in the fishbowl. He wasn't actually using his ethical principles to get out. So, I said to him one day, I just had So he had a highly charged ethical self that projected that onto objects of power around him that he saw victimized him. He was angry and hostile against the oppressive authorities. But I had a hunch Rex was ready to get out. One day I said, I wonder if I can speak to your ethical self. What if we were to compare your current self-caring manager to the one you're experiencing at work, who is your boss and manager? And, first of all, he's sort of like, oh, no comparison, and he'd sort of charged off. But then when we actually got down to it, there was no difference to him pushing himself out the door every day, doing something. I mean, he was doing the pushing. And he was in a complete neglect of his interests. He thought the manager, this was so boring, why didn't they, create anything interesting to do? But he was the one who was neglecting himself. He was checking out on his interests. So tackling the issue that way, he hated being his boss. He was like, no, I'm not going to be that guy. I'm not going to be that guy. And, it snapped at the heels. It just released this incredible power. It snapped at the heels of his slave to that. He was enrolled in slavery. It snapped at the heels of that. It snapped at his sloth and the pusher that forced him to do the work. And he just saw that he was living inside the mythology, the scarcity myth, that life, he wasn't enough for life. Life wasn't enough. It wasn't going to provide enough. This is as much as he could hope for. This tiny crumb of his existence was as much as he could hope for. So he saw the cost of that the trances were getting to him. He was addicted to the comfort zone, in despairing tolerance of his perceived battleground of his life. This released a power and refused, and he just couldn't stand being his boss and he began to connect back to himself and connect back to those passions and connect back to how could he stop being like his boss? How could he stop perpetrating harm on himself? How could he make life better? How for himself, but anyway, I won't go to the story, but through other people. How were these passions of his not serving other people? And how could it be fair, respectful to himself and lovingly kind? Not just to him, but the people who might benefit from his passions. So today, his story is 4 years later. He has a vintage car blog. He interviews car restorers at car shows. He does cartooning commercially for seminars. Has a wonderful job that he loves in an online magazine for popular for sci-fi. He draws vintage cars, car owners in their cars in stylized copies of 1920s posters, and his wife is and him are very happy. So today I would say he's living outside of his myth that enough is enough. They're modest, but he's got enough. And when enough is enough, it's always enough. So on that note,
That's enough.
thank you. I think there's a lot of supper, and I know you've probably been sitting here for a long time, so yeah, Victoria. I'm happy to talk and answer questions.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that last example of yours, and thinking about how many years ago, in fact it's now many decades ago, I ditched the job that was driving me totally around the twist, and decided to go and save the world instead. And it, as